This is the story of one of the most audacious espionage missions in the history of exploration. A man walks alone across a forbidden empire, disguised as a wandering Buddhist pilgrim. If anyone discovers who he really is, the punishment is death. He carries no map because a map would get him killed on the spot. Instead, he carries a string of prayer beads with 8 beads secretly removed, and every 100 steps, without ever breaking his stride or his murmured prayers, he lets 1 bead slide between his fingers. His name was Nain Singh Rawat. Between 1865 and 1875, he crossed well over 1,000 miles of Tibet, a country that had banned every foreigner on pain of death, and he measured almost the entire distance, one silent, counted footstep at a time. Chapter 1: A Rosary with 8 Beads Missing. Let's travel back to a village at the foot of a Himalayan glacier and follow this quiet, unassuming schoolteacher all the way to the gold medal stage of the Royal Geographical Society in London, a stage he never once set foot on because he was 3,000 miles away, at home, when he received it. I will mention up front that much of what follows draws on Derek Waller's definitive 1990 history, the Pundits, along with Nain Singh's own surviving field diaries and the reports the Survey of India published from them. I'll flag it wherever the record is uncertain, because parts of this story come to us only secondhand, decades after the fact, from a man who spent his entire working life making absolutely sure nothing he carried could ever be traced back to what he actually was. Let's start with who that man was before any of this began. He was born in 1830 in the village of Milam, high in the Johar Valley of the Kumaon Himalayas, a settlement so remote and so seasonally brutal that it was only habitable a few months out of the year, when the snow briefly allowed it. Nain Singh belonged to the Bhotia people, a community that had spent generations as trans-Himalayan traders, moving salt, wool, and borax back and forth across the passes between Tibet and the Indian plains. It's important to consider what that upbringing actually gave him, because it explains almost everything that follows. Growing up, Bhotia meant growing up genuinely bilingual, fluent in both Hindi and Tibetan, and growing up with an intimate, practical understanding of Tibetan Buddhist customs, dress, and daily ritual, not as an outside observer studying a foreign culture, but as someone who had traded with these same communities his entire life. Nain Singh trained as a school teacher, and it's worth pausing on this detail because it's the literal origin of the word history would use to describe him and hundreds of men like him. In Hindi, a learned man, a teacher, is called a pandit. The British corrupted that word slightly and gave it a very different job description, pundit, their term for the small corps of Indian secret agents who would go on to survey some of the most dangerous, most forbidden territory on earth, entirely on foot, entirely in disguise, and entirely without the knowledge of the governments whose territory they were quietly measuring. Now, before Nain Singh was ever a spy, he was a guide. In 1855, 2 German brothers named Hermann and Robert Schlagentveit hired him to help lead a scientific expedition through Tibet and the western Himalayas. Nain Singh taught them Tibetan. They taught him, almost as a byproduct of simply working alongside them for months, the basics of surveying, how to use instruments, how to think about elevation and distance, how a landscape actually gets turned into a map. By every account, the brothers were impressed enough that they later invited him to travel to England with them. He declined, partly out of social pressure at home, and partly at his cousin's urging. I think it's worth sitting with that decision for a moment, because it's a genuine fork in the road most retellings skip past entirely. Had he said yes, this story almost certainly never happens the way it did. Instead, Nain Singh went back to teaching in a small village school, an ordinary, undramatic life for several more years, entirely unaware that a British officer 300 miles away was about to go looking for exactly the kind of man he happened to be. I want to pause here because I think it's genuinely worth explaining why the British needed a man like Nain Singh at all, rather than simply sending their own surveyors across the border themselves. By the 1860s, British India's Great Trigonometrical Survey had triangulated an enormous stretch of the subcontinent with a level of precision that remains, honestly, one of the great scientific achievements of the entire 19th century. But that chain of measurement stopped dead at the Himalayan watershed. Beyond it lay Tibet, sealed off from all foreigners by both its own government and its Chinese overlords, and beyond that lay the Central Asian Khanats that Britain and Russia were quietly circling each other around in the long, tense standoff historians would later nickname the Great Game. A European caught surveying inside Tibet could expect, at absolute best, immediate expulsion. At worst, he could expect to be killed. I think this is genuinely worth pausing on because it's not an abstract risk, and I don't want to just assert it and move on. In 1857, a young German explorer named Adolf von Schlagenteit, the third of the three brothers who had once employed Nain Singh, was captured by a local ruler in Kashgar, in what is now western China, on suspicion of being a spy. He was beheaded, and his skull was reportedly displayed on a wall as a warning to anyone else who might come looking. I mention this not for shock value, but because I think you need to hold this image in your head for the rest of the story. This is what discovery meant. Every single time Nain Singh crossed a border checkpoint, shared a meal with a suspicious stranger, or answered a question about his accent just a beat too slowly, he was gambling with exactly this outcome. Keep that in mind. It is going to come uncomfortably close to happening more than once. I will mention, too, just how blank these particular stretches of the map genuinely were to British eyes at this point. A senior officer with the survey later described the situation in blunt terms, noting that their transfrontier maps of the entire region were, in his own words, almost entirely blank. This wasn't a case of imperfect detail or outdated information. Vast stretches of territory that Britain considered strategically vital, the exact land a rival Russian advance might eventually cross, simply did not exist on any reliable British map at all. That blankness was not just an inconvenience for mapmakers back in London. In the tense, decades-long standoff of the Great Game, not knowing the terrain between your own frontier and a rival empire's advancing influence was a genuine strategic vulnerability, and closing that gap in knowledge, by whatever means proved possible, had become a quiet but urgent priority. Faced with this problem, a British survey officer named Captain Thomas George Montgomery proposed around 1862 a solution that sounds almost absurdly simple once you hear it, and turned out to be one of the most quietly brilliant intelligence operations of the entire imperial era. If Europeans couldn't survive inside these forbidden territories, why not train Indians, men who could blend in completely, who already spoke the languages and understood the customs, to carry out the same surveys in disguise? On the recommendation of an education officer named Edmund Smith, who personally knew Nain Singh from his teaching days, Montgomery's attention landed on the former schoolteacher from Milam. In 1863, Nain Singh and his cousin Mani Singh were recruited and brought to the survey's headquarters in Dehradun at a starting salary of 20 rupees a month, a genuinely modest sum for what they were about to be asked to risk. What's important here is that neither man was a trained scientist walking in. They were about to become one, from scratch, in a program built entirely around a single elegant problem. How do you carry a surveyor's precision inside a body that isn't allowed to be seen carrying anything at all? Let me explain exactly what that training actually looked like, because I think the details are the whole reason this story earns its place here. Over nearly 2 years at Dehradun, Nain Singh and Nain Singh learned celestial navigation, learned to identify major stars and constellations well enough to fix a latitude from them, learned to read a compass and a sextant, and learned the single technique this entire mission would ultimately depend on. Measuring distance not with any instrument that could be discovered and confiscated, but with their own bodies. They were drilled for months until they could walk at an absolutely fixed, mechanically consistent pace, roughly 33 inches per stride, regardless of terrain, fatigue, or altitude, calibrated so that 2,000 of these steps covered almost exactly 1 mile. Now, here's the part I think is genuinely ingenious. A Buddhist pilgrim walking any road in Asia is expected to be endlessly turning a string of prayer beads, a mala, murmuring the same repeated mantra over and over for hours at a stretch. Nobody looks twice at that. So the survey took an ordinary Buddhist rosary, which traditionally carries 108 beads, and quietly removed 8 of them, leaving exactly 100. Every 100th step, instead of simply continuing the prayer, Nain Singh would let 1 bead slip through his fingers, a pilgrim's rosary to any watching eye, doing exactly what a pilgrim's rosary is supposed to do. In his own hands, it was a functioning odometer, accurate enough to measure 1,000 miles the Tibetan road to within a small margin of error, and it never once looked like anything other than what it appeared to be. They built the rest of his disguise around that same principle: a Buddhist prayer wheel. The cylindrical device pilgrims spin constantly while walking traditionally holds scrolls of printed prayers inside its drum. Nain Singh's prayer wheel held those scrolls too, but tucked in among them were also strips of paper carrying his actual coded survey notes, his compass readings, his star observations, numbers disguised inside what looked, to anyone who ever opened it, like devotional text. A small compass was hidden inside the wheel's lid. Mercury, needed to create an artificial level horizon for taking accurate star sightings at night, was carried in the hollow shells of cowrie beads and poured, when needed, into his begging bowl. A mercury thermometer for measuring the boiling point of water, and from that, altitude, was concealed inside the hollow shaft of his walking staff. His robes themselves were sewn with false bottom pockets. Even the wooden chest he traveled with, ordinary-looking storage for a pilgrim's meager possessions, had a secret compartment built into its base specifically for a sextant. I want to pause on all of this for a second, because I think it's worth sitting with just how much quiet, patient theater this actually was. Nain Singh wasn't simply carrying hidden tools. He had to become, completely and convincingly, a devout pilgrim, for months at a time, with no breaks, no days off from the performance, while simultaneously running an exact, silent mathematical count in his head that could never once slip, because a wrong count meant a wrong map, and a wrong map, delivered after risking his life to gather it, would have made the entire mission worthless. Before we continue, I think it's worth pausing on the sheer mental discipline this actually demanded, because I don't think counting to 100 quite captures it. He had to do this while making conversation with suspicious strangers, while negotiating prices in a market, while fording rivers and climbing over 17,000-foot passes, while genuinely, convincingly performing the outward behavior of religious devotion, all without the count in his head ever once dropping a single step. If you found your way here and you like watching history's forgotten corners get pulled back into the light, sticking around and subscribing genuinely helps more of these get made. And if you want to dig into the primary sources yourself, they're linked below. Anyway, Let's send this quiet former schoolteacher across the border, because in 1865, after 2 years of training, Nain Singh Rawat was finally ready to walk into a country that would kill him if it ever found out who he really was. Chapter 2: The Bushari Trader. In the autumn of 1865, Nain Singh set out from Dehradun with his cousin Mani Singh, heading first toward Kathmandu in Nepal, roughly 450 miles away, a journey the two men completed in about 2 months, counting every step of it along the way. Picture what that first stretch of the journey must have actually felt like, because I think it's easy to skip past it as a simple transition between training and the real mission. This was the very first time either man had put nearly 2 years of Dehradun's careful instruction into genuine practice, walking at their trained pace hour after hour, letting beads slip through their fingers while making small talk with strangers on the road, testing for the first time under real conditions whether any of it would actually hold up outside a controlled training environment. Every village they passed through, every official who glanced at their papers, every fellow traveler who asked an idle question about where they'd come from, was a small, low-stakes rehearsal for the much higher-stakes version of the same performance that was waiting for them across the Tibetan border. From Kathmandu, the plan was to push north into Tibet itself. It did not go smoothly. Dressed in Tibetan clothing and speaking fluent Tibetan, the two men attempted to cross through a pass called Kairong, carrying their hidden instruments sewn into their clothing exactly as they'd been trained to. A Tibetan police officer stopped them at the border and informed them, flatly, that the route was closed to travelers. Try to imagine that specific moment, because it's worth sitting with the very particular kind of tension it must have produced. Learns everyone else's business in broad strokes, if not in fine detail, simply through the accumulated boredom and proximity of weeks spent walking the same road together. Nain Singh had to be, convincingly, a fully participating member of that social world, sharing food, trading small talk, answering the same handful of questions about where he was from and where he was headed dozens of times over from dozens of different people without ever once giving an answer that contradicted something he'd said to someone else 2 days earlier. It's a different, quieter kind of pressure than the more dramatic danger of a border checkpoint, but I think it was, in its own way, just as demanding, sustained continuously rather than concentrated into a single tense encounter. Let me explain what the actual mechanics of the mission looked like now that he was finally moving through Tibetan territory for real, because I think it's worth returning to that rosary one more time before things get more dangerous. Every single day of this journey, for hours at a stretch, Nain Singh walked at his rigorously trained pace, letting a bead slip every 100 steps while simultaneously making conversation with fellow travelers, haggling over food and lodging, and performing every outward behavior expected of a devout, slightly tedious pilgrim who never seemed to stop praying. At night, when the rest of the caravan slept, he would sometimes slip away to take star sightings with the sextant hidden in his chest, using the mercury poured from a cowrie shell into his begging bowl to create the level, reflective surface the sighting required. In the morning, before anyone else woke, he transferred the previous day's readings into his coded notes, tucked them back inside the prayer wheel among the genuine devotional scrolls, and rejoined the caravan exactly where he'd left it, having slept only a few hours, carrying inside his own memory and his own modified rosary, the only working map of a country determined to make sure no such map ever existed. I want you to imagine for a moment what it must have taken to sustain this every single day for months without a single lapse. Caravans of this era move slowly, often no more than 15 or 20 miles a day, which meant Nain Singh's silent count needed to hold steady across thousands of individual repetitions of the same 100-step cycle, day after day, in freezing wind, through river crossings that could easily throw off a person's natural stride, all while never once letting his face or his conversation betray that any part of his attention was elsewhere. A single sneeze at the wrong moment, a stumble on loose scree, a fellow traveler asking an unexpected question right as he reached his 100th step, any of it could cost him the count entirely, forcing him to either quietly restart or simply accept an error he could never fully correct later. It's the kind of sustained, invisible concentration that has no dramatic moment attached to it at all, no single scene you could point a camera at, and yet it is genuinely the hardest and most impressive part of everything he did. Before we continue, I do want to acknowledge something about the accuracy of all this, because I think honesty about the method actually makes the achievement more impressive rather than less. Nain Singh's pace count was extraordinarily consistent, but it was never going to be flawless. Steep climbs, river crossings, and difficult terrain all subtly changed his natural stride length, and the training at Dehradun could only do so much to correct for that in the field. When his figures were eventually cross-checked back in India against known trigonometric fixed points, they came remarkably close, off by a margin small enough to genuinely astonish the professional surveyors reviewing them, but not perfect. I think that's worth sitting with for a second. This wasn't magic. It was an ordinary human being, walking an extraordinary distance under extraordinary psychological pressure, doing math in his head the entire time, and getting close enough to the truth that it reshaped what an empire thought it knew about half a continent. The caravan pushed on from Tradam, through towns called Ratong, Sigatse, and Gyantse, deeper into a Tibet that had never once, in living memory, knowingly hosted an agent of British India. Along the way, the caravan passed close enough to Tashil Humpo, the great monastery seat of the Panchen Lama, one of the two most senior figures in Tibetan Buddhism, that Nain Singh was able to visit it directly, moving through its courtyards and halls with the same quiet, unremarkable pilgrim's bearing he'd maintained since Kathmandu. I will mention, because it foreshadows something that comes back later, that this would not be his only visit to a great center of Tibetan religious authority on this journey, and that his instinct for knowing exactly how much attention he could safely draw to himself, learned here at Tashil Humpo among crowds of genuine pilgrims, would be tested far more severely once he reached his real destination. For now, though, the caravan kept moving toward the single destination this entire 2-year training program had been built around, and on January 10th, 1866, after roughly 500 miles of travel from Tradam alone, Nain Singh Rawat walked, disguised, uninvited, and entirely undetected, into the forbidden city of Lhasa. If you've made it this far into the story, this is exactly the kind of patient, high-wire tension this channel loves digging into, and if that's the sort of thing you enjoy, there's a subscribe button that genuinely helps keep more of these coming. Now, let's follow him inside the one city on Earth his entire mission existed to reach, because the real danger, the kind that could get him killed rather than simply turned back at a checkpoint, is only just beginning. Chapter 3 100 Days in the Forbidden City. Nain Singh spent nearly 100 days in Lhasa, and I think it's worth being honest about how differently this stretch of the mission needed to be handled compared to the road that led up to it. Let me set the scene for a moment, because I think the arrival itself deserves more than a passing mention. Picture walking, after 500 miles on foot, into a city whose golden roofs and towering white palace walls had been described to European geographers for decades almost entirely in rumor and secondhand hearsay, a city so thoroughly sealed off from the outside world that its very shape on a map was still, at that point, mostly guesswork. Nain Singh arrived not as a triumphant discoverer planting a flag, but as one more anonymous face in a caravan of traders and pilgrims, doing everything in his power to be exactly as unremarkable as everyone walking beside him. There was no moment of arrival he could afford to visibly savor. The entire skill of this work was making the most significant moment of his professional life look, to anyone watching, like nothing at all. On the open trail, a pilgrim's disguise mostly just needed to survive brief, passing encounters with strangers he'd likely never see twice. In Lhasa, he needed a sustainable cover identity, one that could hold up under sustained scrutiny, day after day, for months in a city that was, by its own government's explicit policy, actively hostile to the presence of any outsider at all. He found one in an occupation that suited him almost perfectly. He presented himself as a teacher of accounts, quietly tutoring local merchants and officials in bookkeeping, a genuinely useful skill that gave him a legitimate reason to be seen taking notes, doing arithmetic, and asking practical questions about trade, distances, and local geography, all without arousing the slightest suspicion. It's a wonderfully elegant piece of tradecraft if you sit with it. The actual survey work, careful, patient calculation recorded in writing, hidden in plain sight behind a job that was, in every visible respect, exactly what it appeared to be. Try to picture what an ordinary day actually looked like for him during this stretch. Mornings might be spent with a local merchant's ledger spread across a low table, genuinely teaching double-entry bookkeeping while quietly steering the conversation toward how far it was to the next trading post, or how many days a caravan typically took to reach a particular monastery, information any curious accounts teacher might reasonably ask, and information a surveyor desperately needed. Afternoons meant walking the city itself, letting his rosary do its quiet work as he moved between the Barkor market circuit and the base of the Patala, appearing to any onlooker as simply one more foreign trader going about his errands. Evenings, once his hosts and students had gone to sleep, meant the sextant, the mercury, and the stars, the one part of the day when Nain Singh could finally stop performing an identity and simply do the actual work he'd come to do, alone, in the dark, on a rooftop in the most forbidden city in Asia. Let me describe what he actually managed to accomplish during these 100 days, because the scope of it is genuinely remarkable. He observed and quietly measured the Patala Palace, the towering seat of the Dalai Lama's government, from multiple angles, walking wide, apparently aimless circuits around its base that let him triangulate its position and scale without ever once appearing to do anything more purposeful than a pilgrim's customary circumambulation of a sacred site. At night, on the rooftop of wherever he was lodging, he continued taking star sightings with his hidden sextant, using that same mercury in a bowl trick to fix Lhasa's precise latitude through pure celestial navigation, ultimately completing something like 20 separate solar and stellar observations. Using the boiling point thermometer concealed in his staff, he calculated Lhasa's altitude at roughly 11,700 feet above sea level, a figure astonishingly close to the true altitude, which sits closer to 11,600, a margin of error any modern surveyor would consider genuinely excellent, achieved with instruments a curious guard could have discovered by patting down the wrong sleeve. On February 15, 1866, Nain Singh took part in Losar, the Tibetan New Year celebrations, blending into crowds gathered for one of the most significant events on the entire Tibetan religious calendar, filling the streets and temple courtyards with music, incense, and thousands of pilgrims from across the plateau, exactly the kind of dense, anonymous crowd where a disguised agent could move freely without ever standing out. He was even extended an invitation to a formal audience with the young Dalai Lama himself, who at that point was still a boy of about 13. I think this moment deserves real attention because it's a genuine test of discipline dressed up as an opportunity. You might think a spy this deep into a mission this dangerous would seize an audience with the single most important figure in the entire country, a moment of genuine historical significance he could carry home with him for the rest of his life. He did not. According to the record, Nain Singh quietly declined, having begun to sense that some of the people around him were growing suspicious of his behavior and judging correctly that stepping into a formal, closely observed court ceremony was exactly the kind of exposure his mission could not survive. It's a small, almost invisible act of restraint, refusing the single most tempting moment of an entire career, and I think it tells you more about what made Nain Singh good at this work than almost anything else in this story. The job was never to have an adventure. The job was to come home with the numbers. That instinct for caution turned out to be exactly right, and not a moment too soon. At some point during his stay, 2 Kashmiri Muslim merchants living in Lhasa, men with genuine experience of the wider trading world beyond Tibet's borders, took a closer look at this supposed Bashahri accounts teacher and recognized correctly that he was not who he claimed to be. Try to imagine that specific moment of recognition from Nain Singh's side of it. There's no dramatic confrontation recorded, no scene where he's cornered and interrogated. What likely happened, based on how these encounters tend to unfold in the broader record of the Pundit missions, is something quieter and in some ways more frightening. A conversation that starts perfectly normally, a shared joke, or a passing comment about a place both men happen to know, and then a small pause, a look that lingers a half-second too long, the sudden sinking realization that the person across from you knows something about your accent, your mannerisms, or your supposed hometown that doesn't add up. There's no way to run in that moment. There's no way to explain it away without making things worse. All you can do is keep talking, keep the conversation moving, and hope the silence that follows doesn't turn into an accusation spoken out loud in a room in a city where an accusation like that could be a death sentence within the hour. I want you to sit with this moment because it's the exact scenario every single hour of his training in Dehradun had been designed to prevent, and it had just happened anyway, in the one city on earth where discovery carried the highest possible cost. You might reasonably expect this to be the end of the story right here, a betrayal, an arrest, a body that quietly disappears from the historical record the way Adolf von Schlagentweitz did 9 years earlier in Kashgar. But no, the 2 merchants did not report him. Instead, in one of the stranger and more quietly generous turns in this entire story, they lent him a small sum of money, taking his pocket watch as collateral against the loan. Whatever they suspected about who he actually worked for, and the record doesn't tell us exactly how much they'd pieced together, they chose discretion over betrayal, and for reasons that remain genuinely unclear to history, a stranger's decency in a forbidden city is the reason the story didn't end in 1866. Nain Singh, understanding exactly how thin that margin had just become, judged it was time to leave. European geographers back in London had been arguing for decades over a genuinely enormous unanswered question. Did this river, somewhere beyond the reach of any map, turn south and become the Brahmaputra, the massive river that flows through Assam and into the Bay of Bengal? Or did it flow somewhere else entirely, into a river system nobody had yet connected it to? Nobody actually knew. It was one of the last great unresolved geographical mysteries of the entire Asian continent, and Nain Singh's careful, paced-out survey of the Sangpo's course was about to become the single most important piece of evidence anyone had ever gathered toward answering it. Keep that open question in mind. I promise we'll come back to it, and its answer is stranger and takes far longer to arrive than you might expect. Nain Singh crossed the Mayamla Pass, reached the sacred region around Lake Manasaravar and Mount Kailash in western Tibet, and finally arrived home in Milam on June 29, 1866, before making his way back to the survey's headquarters in Dehradun the following month. He had been gone for the better part of a year, and I think it's worth pausing just briefly on what that homecoming must have actually felt like. His family in Milam had no way of knowing, for the entire duration of his absence, whether he was alive, whether he'd been discovered, or whether he would ever walk back through the village at all. There was no message that could safely travel ahead of him. The first anyone knew that he'd survived was the moment he simply appeared, on foot, at the edge of the village he'd grown up in, carrying inside a prayer wheel the evidence of everything he'd risked to bring home. He had walked, by his own careful count, something in the neighborhood of 1,200 miles entirely on foot, disguised the entire time, and he arrived carrying inside that same modified prayer wheel the first reasonably accurate fix on the location and altitude of Lhasa that any government outside Tibet had ever possessed. I think it's worth pausing here, because I want you to actually feel the scale of what just happened, rather than just hear the numbers go by. For decades, European maps of Tibet had been built almost entirely out of guesswork, secondhand rumor, and a handful of unreliable older accounts with entire regions rendered as blank space or filled in with confident-looking lines that were, in truth, little more than informed speculation. A single disguised schoolteacher, walking at a carefully trained pace and counting silently on a modified rosary, had just replaced all of that guesswork with real, verifiable measurement. Montgomery and his colleagues compiled Nain Singh's route surveys, star fixes, and altitude readings into the Survey of India's official reports and maps, which were then shared in edited and often carefully redacted form with the wider geographical community through the Royal Geographical Society's own journal back in London. A schoolteacher's careful, silent count, converted first into coded notes hidden inside a prayer wheel, then into a formal written report, then into a published map that professional geographers on the other side of the world would study and cite for decades afterward. You might think, given how well this first mission went, that the hardest part of Nain Singh's career was now safely behind him. But no. The survey had already decided he was too valuable to leave at a desk, and within a year he was walking again, this time into a different corner of the same forbidden country, chasing rumors of gold. I should mention, before we go any further, that human suspicion was never the only threat these journeys carried, and in some ways it wasn't even the most constant one. The terrain itself was trying to kill him just as persistently as any curious merchant or border guard. Altitude sickness struck without warning at passes above 16 and 17,000 feet, capable of dropping an experienced traveler with crushing headaches, nausea, and a dangerous shortness of breath that no amount of training could fully guard against. Snow blindness, caused by unfiltered glare off endless fields of high-altitude snow, could leave a man temporarily unable to see at all, a genuinely terrifying prospect for someone whose entire safety depended on staying alert to everyone around him. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes on more than one of these expeditions, and all of it had to be endured while maintaining, without fail, the outward appearance of an ordinary traveler simply going about ordinary business, because collapsing visibly from altitude sickness in front of the wrong witness was its own kind of exposure risk. The danger in this story was never only about being caught. It was also, every single day, simply about staying alive long enough to be caught at all. In May of 1867, Nain Singh set out on a second major expedition, this time accompanied by his cousin Mani Singh and his own brother Kalyan Singh, the three of them disguised once again, this time as Bashari traders moving goods through western Tibet. I think it's worth pausing on how much this entire enterprise had become, by this point, a genuine family undertaking rather than a single man's solitary mission. Nain Singh, his brother, and his cousins were drawing on the exact same Bodhya trading heritage, the same fluency in Tibetan customs and language passed down through generations of legitimate cross-border trade, and turning it, collectively, into one of the most effective intelligence operations the British Empire had ever run. Another cousin, Kishan Singh, would go on to become one of the most celebrated pundits in his own right, eventually surveying territory even Nain Singh never reached. It's a genuinely remarkable thing to sit with, an entire extended family from one remote Himalayan valley quietly became the backbone of an empire's efforts to map half a continent it wasn't allowed to enter. Their target was a place that had circulated through trade routes for years as something close to legend, the goldfields of Thok Jalong, one of the highest and most remote mining operations on Earth. They reached it on August 26, 1867, and what they found there genuinely surprised them. Picture the scene itself for a moment, because it's worth actually seeing rather than just hearing described. Thok Jalong sat at an altitude well above 16,000 feet, a windswept, treeless expanse where the air itself is thin enough to make ordinary walking feel like exertion, let alone digging. Hundreds of tents and rough shelters were scattered across the diggings, home to a shifting population of miners who worked the ground with hand tools through a short summer season before the cold made the site unlivable again. The miners, working at an altitude that made even breathing difficult, extracted gold only from the shallow surface layers of the ground, deliberately refusing to dig any deeper out of a sincerely held belief that digging too far into the earth was a crime against it, one that would poison the land's future fertility. I love this detail, honestly, because it's such a striking philosophical counterpoint, sitting right in the middle of an intelligence-gathering mission built entirely around extracting value for an empire on the other side of a mountain range. Here was a community that had access to one of the most sought-after resources on the planet, and had collectively decided, on religious and ethical grounds, not to take more of it than the surface would freely give. Nain Singh recorded it as one of the coldest, most physically punishing places he had ever visited in his life, and I don't think that's a small claim from a man whose entire career was defined by extreme cold. This second expedition covered roughly 850 miles, mapped a significant stretch of the Sutlej River, verified the location of the trading post at Gartok, and, like the first, was punctuated by real physical danger along the way. Encounters with Tibetan bandits, severe frostbite, and the kind of relentless high-altitude weather that had already claimed the lives of far better equipped European expeditions. And if you've made it about halfway through this story, thank you, genuinely, and if you haven't already, hitting subscribe is a real help in getting more of these made. Now, before we follow Nain Singh on his third and final expedition, I want to slow down and look honestly at exactly what all of this was actually in service of. Now, I want to slow down here because I think this is the moment in Nain Singh's story that deserves the most honest, unflinching look, and it's worth doing before we push into his final, greatest journey. Because everything we've celebrated so far, the courage, the ingenuity, the sheer physical and mental discipline of counting 100,000 footsteps without ever losing count, was all being placed directly in service of something worth naming plainly: British colonial intelligence gathering inside a sovereign nation that had explicitly, repeatedly banned foreign entry specifically to protect itself from exactly this kind of imperial encroachment. Tibet did not invite Nain Singh in. Tibet had gone out of its way, at real diplomatic and military cost, to keep men exactly like him out. What he gathered on these voyages, the precise location of Lhasa, the confirmed existence of workable gold deposits at Thok Jalong, detailed route surveys of trade corridors and mountain passes, was not simply neutral scientific curiosity. It was the exact kind of strategic and economic intelligence an expanding empire needed in order to eventually act on a country it did not yet control. It's worth remembering that less than 30 years after these expeditions, in 1904, a British military expedition under Francis Younghusband would march an armed force into Tibet, using maps and route knowledge substantially built on the foundation these same disguised Pundit surveys had first established. That expedition ended at a place called Chumik Shenko, with British Maxim guns cutting down several hundred Tibetan soldiers who were armed largely with antique matchlocks and swords, and who had, by several accounts, been ordered by their own commanders not to fire first. It was less a battle than a massacre, and it happened, in no small part, because the British officers planning that march already knew, in granular detail, exactly which passes to take, how far apart the water sources sat, and how many days the journey to Lhasa actually required, information that traced directly back to men like Nain Singh, walking those same roads decades earlier with a rosary in one hand and a hidden compass in the other. In India today, Nain Singh is remembered overwhelmingly as a national scientific pioneer, not as a colonial collaborator, and I think that reading has real merit too. He was, after all, an Indian man working within an Indian institution, using skills and knowledge rooted in his own Bhotia trading heritage to accomplish something no purely European effort could have achieved at all. The empire supplied the funding and the instructions. The actual genius, the actual physical courage, the actual cultural fluency that made any of this possible belonged entirely to him and to the small circle of Himalayan men trained alongside him. Both of these things are true at once, and I don't think the story is well served by picking only one of them. He was an instrument of colonial intelligence gathering, and he was also a supremely skilled Indian scientist whose personal achievement deserves to be measured on its own terms, separate from who ultimately paid for it and what they eventually did with it. Before we continue, I want to bring us back to the mission's technical heart one more time, because I think it's worth remembering exactly what tool was making all of this possible while we sit with its more complicated implications. That same modified rosary, that same hollow staff, that same prayer wheel stuffed with coded notes among genuine scripture, had by this point already carried Nain Singh across 2 entire expeditions and well over 2,000 miles of some of the most hostile terrain on the planet. It's worth remembering, too, that none of this equipment had changed much since his very first crossing into Nepal nearly a decade earlier. The same basic 100-bead rosary, the same hollow staff, the same trick with mercury and a cowrie shell. Whatever refinements the survey's engineers had made along the way were minor compared to the raw, repeated discipline of the man actually using them, and I think that consistency says something important about this entire program. It was never really about the cleverness of the tools. Plenty of clever disguises and hidden instruments would have meant nothing without a person capable of walking a fixed pace for 1,000 miles without ever once losing count. And in 1873, at the request of General James Walker, who had succeeded Montgomery as the survey's superintendent, Nain Singh picked up that same rosary one final time for a mission that would turn out to be the longest, most dangerous, and most significant of his entire career. He was initially attached to a larger semi-official diplomatic mission led by Sir Thomas Douglas Forsyth, traveling to Yarkand and Kashgar in Chinese Turkestan, alongside his cousin Kishan Singh and his brother Kalyan. This mission, which departed in 1873 and reached Yarkand that November, was a different kind of undertaking entirely from Nain Singh's earlier solo infiltrations, a large, officially recognized diplomatic party moving openly through territory whose rulers had at least nominally agreed to receive it. The route itself took the party across some of the most punishing high-altitude desert terrain in Central Asia, over the Karakoram Range and down into the Tarim Basin, a landscape of extremes that shifted sometimes within a single day's march, from bitter alpine cold to the dry, sun-baked heat of desert oasis towns. Nain Singh spent nearly 5 months in the region, and while the mission itself gave him relatively little room to break new ground on his own, working under official cover rather than disguise, the exposure to yet another stretch of previously unmapped Central Asian territory only added to the accumulating body of geographical knowledge the survey now had at its disposal. The mission's various members eventually mapped a direct route of some 1,500 kilometers connecting India to Turkestan, bypassing the territory controlled by a rival regional power entirely, and the resulting book the expedition later published ran to more than 500 pages, illustrated with some of the first photographs many of these regions had ever had taken of them. I will mention, because I think it's a small, telling detail about how this whole program actually worked, that despite Nain Singh's central role in the mission's geographical achievements, the published volume includes no photograph of him at all. The English officers who wrote admiringly of his fearlessness in impossible terrain apparently didn't consider his face part of the record worth preserving. It's important to consider what happened next, because it's the moment this entire career had, in retrospect, been building toward. When the Forsyth mission returned to the town of Leh in the summer of 1874, Captain Henry Trotter, who had by then taken over responsibility for these operations from Montgomery, made a decision that would define the rest of Nain Singh's career. Kishan Singh, who might otherwise have been the obvious choice for the mission Trotter had in mind, was suffering from exposure sustained on the earlier stretch of the journey and simply wasn't fit for what came next. So on General Walker's instructions, Trotter dispatched Nain Singh alone by an entirely new route straight across the vast, unmapped northern Tibetan plateau toward Lhasa, a path no surveyor, disguised or otherwise, had ever attempted before. If you've stuck with this story this far, thank you genuinely, and if you haven't already, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because the final stretch of Nain Singh's career is, in my opinion, the most tense and the most quietly heroic part of this entire story. He was now around 44 years old, nearly a decade into a career defined by exactly the kind of grinding physical hardship that wears a body down fast at high altitude, and there is real evidence from the men who worked alongside him during this period that he was genuinely worn out, his body carrying the accumulated cost of a decade spent walking some of the harshest terrain on the planet at a rigidly fixed, punishing pace. And he was about to attempt something no pundit, and very possibly no outsider of any kind, had ever managed, crossing the roof of the world by a route nobody in British India had any prior information about whatsoever, and walking for a second time straight back into the one city that had already come close to discovering exactly who he was. Chapter 4. 2 days in Lhasa, 2 months to get home. The route north of Leh had no name on any British map, no prior survey, no cached knowledge of water sources, safe passes, or hostile territory to avoid. Nain Singh walked it anyway, months of it. Empty, wind-scoured plateau at altitudes that would leave most travelers gasping just standing still, salt lakes with no fresh water anywhere near them, days without meeting another human being at all, which meant days without the cover of a caravan, without the easy anonymity of simply blending into a larger crowd of pilgrims and traders, alone, in other words, in exactly the way this work was never supposed to be done. He kept counting anyway, bead after bead, hundred after hundred, across territory so remote that even the risk of discovery briefly mattered less than the much simpler risk of running out of food, water, or luck before reaching anywhere that had any of the three. November 18th, 1874, 8 years and 10 months since he'd last seen it. Nain Singh walks into Lhasa for the second time. No one has ever done this before. No pundit, no disguised agent of any kind. He is, at this moment, the only outsider alive to enter this forbidden city twice and live to tell anyone about it. Every risk that had nearly ended this story back in 1866, the suspicious glance, the slightly wrong answer to an innocent question, the sheer improbability of a stranger's face going unnoticed in a small, tightly knit trading community was still exactly as present now as it had been the first time. If anything, the risk was worse. He was a decade older, recognizably so, and Lhasa's Kashmiri and Ladakhi trading communities were small enough that a face seen once, years earlier, was a face some of them might plausibly still remember. He doesn't get to enjoy it. The first person he meets is a trader from Leh, a man who knows him, a man who recognizes his face immediately before Nain Singh has said a single word about who he's supposed to be this time. The trader doesn't report him to the authorities. He does something worse. He starts asking for money. Blackmail, in a city where discovery still means death, is its own kind of sentence, and Nain Singh understands the math immediately. Word travels fast in a small trading community. A blackmailer today can become an informant tomorrow, the moment the price isn't high enough, or the moment someone else offers more for the same information. There's no way to simply pay the man once and consider the problem solved. Every rupee handed over would only confirm to the trader exactly how much he had to gain by asking for more. And every day Nain Singh stayed in the city was another day for that same trader, or anyone he happened to mention it to decide that turning informant might be worth even more than blackmail. He has two options: pay indefinitely and hope the demands never grow, or leave immediately before rumors about a British spy in the city reach anyone with the authority to act on them. He chooses to leave. 2 days. That's all the time he allows himself in the one place his entire 10-year career had been building toward a second time. Let me explain the exit, because I think it's the single best piece of tradecraft in this entire story, and I don't want to rush past it. Nain Singh could not simply walk out the front gate with all his gear and vanish. That would look exactly like what it was, a man fleeing. So he left behind his bulkier belongings with his landlord, explaining calmly that he was leaving briefly on a short pilgrimage to a monastery north of the city, and that he'd be back within the month to collect everything. It's a small, quiet lie, built entirely to buy him time and throw off anyone who came looking. His small party left the city heading north, exactly as he'd said they would. As soon as darkness fell, they turned around, 180 degrees, straight back south toward India, in the opposite direction from everything he'd just told his landlord. If anyone was watching the northern road for a returning pilgrim, they would watch it for weeks for a man who was never coming back that way at all. Before he went any further, Nain Singh made one more decision, and I think it tells you everything about what actually mattered to him in this moment. He sent 2 of his assistants ahead, separately, carrying the full written record of everything he'd measured and observed on this entire unprecedented crossing of the northern plateau, his star observations, his route survey, his compass bearings, the coded notes tucked inside that same modified prayer wheel one more time. If something happened to him on the road south, if he was caught, arrested, or simply vanished the way Adolf von Schlagentweit had vanished in Kashgar 17 years earlier, the data itself would still get home. His own life and the survival of his life's work were, for the first time in this entire story, deliberately separated from one another, sent down 2 different roads so that only one of them needed to make it. The two assistants reached Lhasa safely in January of 1875, delivering everything intact to the British Joint Commissioner months before anyone knew for certain whether Nain Singh himself would ever make it out of Tibet at all. Both did, but not without one more delay nobody in Dehradun could have predicted. Nain Singh's own route took him southeast toward Tawang, a route that would eventually bring him down into Assam, in the far northeast of British India. But Tawang, it turned out, was caught up in its own local trade dispute, entirely unrelated to anything about Nain Singh personally. Merchants in the district were deliberately blocking travelers coming from Lhasa, trying to protect their own monopoly on trade heading toward the Indian border. Nain Singh, a stranger with no local standing and no way to quickly prove his business was any different from theirs, was swept up in that blockade and effectively detained, held in place from December 24th through the following February, nearly 2 full months, forced to wait out a commercial dispute that had nothing whatsoever to do with the empire he secretly worked for. I think it's worth sitting with the specific cruelty of that delay, because it's such a strange, almost absurd way for this particular danger to arrive. He had survived a blackmail attempt in the most heavily guarded city in Asia. He had thrown off pursuers with a fabricated pilgrimage story and a nighttime reversal of direction. And now, having escaped all of that, he found himself stuck for 2 months not because anyone suspected he was a spy, but because a group of local merchants wanted to protect their trade margins. There was no daring escape to be made from this particular trap, no clever piece of disguise or tradecraft that could talk his way past a commercial dispute that had nothing to do with him personally. He simply had to wait day after day through the depths of a Himalayan winter with no clear end date and no way of knowing whether the underlying situation might shift from a local trade squabble into something that noticed him specifically and asked harder questions about who he actually was. You might think, after everything else this journey had already thrown at him, that this would be a minor inconvenience, a footnote. For a man in his mid-40s, already worn thin by nearly a decade of exactly this kind of accumulated hardship, 2 more months of uncertain detention, with no way of knowing whether the underlying blockade might eventually turn into something more dangerous, must have felt like its own kind of small, grinding ordeal. Eventually, by depositing nearly everything of value he had left and promising once again that he would return for it after one more short pilgrimage across the border, Nain Singh talked his way free. On March 1st, 1875, he walked into Udalguri in Assam and presented himself to the local British Assistant Commissioner. Try to picture that specific handoff for a moment. A tired, weathered man in pilgrim's robes carrying almost nothing after depositing his remaining goods to buy his way out of Tawang, walks into a small colonial outpost and asks to see the local British officer. To that officer, in the moment before Nain Singh identified himself, he would have looked like nothing more than one more anonymous traveler from across the border, indistinguishable from 100 others who might pass through in a given year. It's only once he explained who he actually was and what he had just spent the better part of a year and a half doing that the full scale of what had just walked through the door became clear. I think there's something quietly perfect about that anticlimax, honestly. The single greatest survey achievement of an entire imperial mapping project didn't arrive with fanfare. It arrived on foot, in worn robes, and had to introduce itself before anyone realized what they were looking at. I want to sit with this moment before we move any further, because I think it's the true emotional climax of Nain Singh's entire career, more than the more famous first arrival in Lhasa 9 years earlier. He had just crossed an entirely new route across the whole of northern Tibet, roughly 1,000 miles of terrain no British surveyor, disguised or otherwise, had ever mapped before. He had been recognized, blackmailed and forced to flee the one city that defined his entire life's work, not once now, but twice. He had been detained for 2 months by a dispute that had nothing to do with him, and now, finally in Assam, exhausted, far older than the man who had first walked into Lhasa in 1866, he found the river, the same river. The Tsangpo he had followed for hundreds of miles across the Tibetan plateau on his very first expedition, 9 years earlier, the river whose true destination nobody in London or Calcutta had ever been able to confirm, was here, in front of him, under a different name, the Brahmaputra, flowing exactly where he had spent a decade suspecting it must eventually go. I don't want to overstate what this moment actually proved, because I think honesty matters more here than a clean, satisfying ending. Nain Singh's own observations and the broader body of Pundit surveys built on top of them made the connection between the Chongpo and the Brahmaputra look overwhelmingly likely, but likely is not the same as confirmed, and the single strangest, most stubborn piece of the puzzle, the exact path the river actually takes through a series of Himalayan gorges so steep and so remote that no surveyor had ever successfully followed it, end to end, remained genuinely unresolved. Nain Singh had walked to the edge of one of the 19th century's great unanswered geographical questions and handed the world the single best piece of evidence anyone had yet produced. He had not, quite yet, closed the loop entirely. That answer, it turns out, was still nearly 40 years away, and it would take other men walking other roads to finally finish what he'd started. We'll come back to exactly how that ends, because I think it's a genuinely fitting final note for this whole story. For now, though, in March of 1875, Nain Singh Rawat had done what no one else in the history of the Great Trigonometrical Survey had ever managed. He had crossed the entire breadth of the Tibetan Plateau by a route nobody in British India had ever charted, entered the forbidden capital of a nation that would have killed him on sight for a second time, talked his way out of a blackmail attempt, out of a local trade blockade, and out of one of the most hostile, unmapped landscapes on the planet, and walked out the other side carrying, once again, inside a modified prayer wheel and a rosary with 8 missing beads, a body of survey data that would reshape the map of Asia for the second time in a single career. He had connected, for the first time in the history of British cartography, the known geography of Ladakh in the west with the known geography of Assam in the east, closing a gap on the map that had existed for as long as anyone in Dehradun could remember, and he had done it not with soldiers, not with treaties, and not with any instrument more sophisticated than the ones he'd carried, hidden, since the very first morning he'd left for Kathmandu 9 years earlier. Chapter 5. The medal. He never saw them. Give him, let's take stock of what this one man's career actually added up to, because I think the scale of it is easy to undersell if you only hear the individual expeditions one at a time. Across 3 major journeys between 1865 and 1875, Nain Singh Rawat walked something on the order of 2,000 miles, by some estimates well beyond that once every expedition is counted together, almost the entire distance measured out in his own head, 100 paces at a time, on a rosary built specifically to lie about what it was doing. He produced the first reasonably accurate determination of Lhasa's latitude, longitude, and altitude that any government outside Tibet had ever possessed. He mapped enormous stretches of the Tsangpo River, confirmed the existence and approximate output of the Thokjalung goldfields, surveyed trade routes across regions no outside cartographer had ever set foot in, and completed a west-to-east crossing of the entire Tibetan plateau that connected, for the first time, British India's existing knowledge of Ladakh in the west with its knowledge of Assam in the east. The recognition, when it came slowly, and it came, in a detail I think is worth sitting with, almost entirely without him physically present for any of it. After his first expedition, the Royal Geographical Society sent him an inscribed gold watch. In May of 1877, following the full weight of his 3 combined expeditions, the Society went further, awarding him its Patron's Medal, one of the 2 most prestigious honors in the entire field of geography. Citing his journeys and surveys across Tibet and the upper Brahmaputra, and the fact that he had determined for the first time the true position of Lhasa. Nain Singh was not in London to receive it. A British scholar named Henry Yule accepted the medal on his behalf, and in the acceptance speech delivered to the assembled society, said, in words that have survived in the Society's own records, that this quiet, disguised schoolteacher from a Himalayan village had added more genuine, verified knowledge to the map of Asia than any other individual of his era. I find something almost unbearably fitting in that image, honestly, the single greatest act of the man's career, walking the width of a forbidden country while counting his own footsteps in silence, was honored in London by a man reading a citation out loud to a room Nain Singh would never see, for an achievement built entirely out of never being seen at all. The Indian government, on his retirement from active field work, granted him a village and 1,000 rupees of annual revenue, a genuinely significant reward by the standards of the time, and a striking contrast worth sitting with for a moment against the 20 rupees a month he'd been paid to actually take on the risk in the first place. He spent his remaining working years training the next generation of pundits, including his own cousin Kishan Singh, passing on, quite literally, the exact tradecraft that had defined his own career, the modified rosary, the hidden compass, the coded notes tucked inside a prayer wheel's genuine scripture. It's a fitting kind of legacy for a man whose entire achievement had been built on a technique rather than a single discovery, a method other people could learn, practice, and carry into forbidden territory long after he himself had stopped walking. Nain Singh Rawat died in 1882 at the age of 51, worn down, by most accounts, by nearly 2 decades of exactly the kind of accumulated physical hardship this story has spent the last hour describing. For well over a century afterward, Nain Singh's name remained largely confined to the specialist world of geographical societies and colonial survey records, known mostly to historians of exploration rather than to the general public in either Britain or India. That began to change only in recent decades. In 2004, the Indian government issued a postage stamp bearing his image, formally recognizing him as a national figure in his own right, rather than simply a footnote in someone else's imperial project. Scholars have since returned to his surviving field diaries directly, translating and republishing them alongside the original Royal Geographical Society reports, work that has slowly given readers access to Nain Singh's own voice, rather than only the version of his achievements filtered through the British officers who wrote about him at the time. I think that shift matters. For most of the last century and a half, this was a story told almost entirely by the empire that employed him. It's only recently become possible to read it, at least in part, in his own words. I promised we'd come back to the Changpo, and I want to close that particular loop properly, because I think it's one of the more honest and more satisfying endings buried inside this entire story. Nain Singh's surveys made the connection between the Tsangpo and the Brahmaputra look overwhelmingly probable, but the exact route the river took through its most extreme gorges remained a genuine open mystery for decades after his death. Another pundit, a Sikkimese man named Kinthup, made a remarkable, almost tragic attempt to settle the question in the 1880s, arranging to release hundreds of specially marked logs into the river at a set time so British observers downstream could watch for their arrival and prove the connection once and for all. Kinthup did his part. He was sold into slavery partway through the mission, escaped, and still managed to send the logs downriver on a delayed schedule, along with a letter explaining the new timing. That letter never reached the men who were supposed to be watching for the logs. Nobody ever saw them arrive. It would take until 1913, 31 years after Nain Singh's death, and 33 years after Kinthip's own forgotten sacrifice, for two British surveyors, Frederick Bailey and Henry Morshead, to finally walk the length of the gorge itself and confirm, once and for all, that the Sangpo and the Brahmaputra really were the same river, closing a mystery that had taken 3 separate generations of surveyors walking under 3 separate kinds of danger to finally answer. Now, here's what I want to leave you with, because I genuinely think it's the actual point of telling the story at all. Nain Singh Rawat never carried a weapon into Tibet, and he never needed one. His entire career was built on a piece of engineering so simple it's almost embarrassing to say out loud, a string of beads, missing exactly 8 of them, that let a trained mind turn an ordinary act of walking into an instrument of extraordinary precision. He mapped an empire that had explicitly, violently forbidden being mapped, not through force, and not through some singular flash of genius, but through years of relentless, invisible discipline, a count in his head that never once, across 2,000 miles and multiple near discoveries, was allowed to slip. I think there's something worth sitting with in the fact that the single most effective spy tool of the entire great game wasn't a hidden weapon or a clever piece of Victorian machinery. It was a Buddhist rosary, borrowed from the very culture he was infiltrating, quietly repurposed, one bead at a time, into something its own maker would never have recognized. I keep coming back and thinking about the story to how little of what made Nain Singh remarkable would show up in any dramatic reenactment of his life. There's no sword fight, no chase on horseback, no single decisive moment of physical heroism you could point a camera at and call the climax. The actual heroism here was almost entirely invisible, a silent count held steady in someone's head for months at a stretch, a decision not to attend an audience with the Dalai Lama, a quiet nighttime reversal of direction on a dark road out of Lhasa. It was discipline, sustained far past the point most people could reasonably sustain it, in service of a goal that could only be measured afterward in numbers on a map by people who would never fully understand what it had cost to gather them. Thank you sincerely for spending this time with me and with Nain Singh Rawat. I hope you're well, wherever you are. Goodbye.